The king did not see her. No one did. Alara stood in the alcove behind the fourth marble pillar, a ghost in a gray wool dress, her purpose only to exist at the periphery. Her scent was a nullity, disciplined into the barest whisper of rain-washed stone and chamomile, the scent of a useful omega, a scent that asked for nothing. Before her, the great hall of Stonehold was a sea of crushed velvet and polished steel. Banners thick with dust hung from the high rafters, depicting the snarling wolf of the royal house. At the center of it all, on a throne of dark, unadorned ironwood, sat King Kalen. He was as still and silent as the stone he ruled, his presence a pressure that bent the light around him. He watched his youngest son, Rice, be presented to the court by the boy's official governess, a sharp-faced beta whose scent was all crisp linen and disapproval. Rice, barely 4 summers old, was a pale, fragile thing, his recovery from the gray fever still evident in the faint blue tinge beneath his eyes. Ilara's hands tightened at her side. She knew the exact cadence of his breathing, when sleep eluded him, the precise temperature of the milk he would tolerate, the specific weight of the blanket that calmed his shivers. For 3 weeks, she had not slept more than an hour at a time, brewing poultices, changing sweat-soaked linens, and whispering stories into the dark until her own voice was a threadbare rasp. She saw a little boy who was afraid of the dark. "The governess," prompted Reese, with a gentle push. "Your Grace," the woman said, her voice carrying across the unnerving silence of the hall. Reese stumbled forward, his small ceremonial tunic too heavy for his shoulders. He looked lost, a small boat in a vast, cold ocean. His eyes, dark like his father's, scanned the crowd of impassive faces. They passed over lords and ladies, over guards in their gleaming cuirasses, and then they found her. They found the ghost in the alcove. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. His small face, so pinched with anxiety, softened. A flicker of recognition, of safety. He lifted a small, trembling hand, not to his father, but to her, and then he spoke. His voice was small, but in the tomb-like silence of the hall, it was a thunderclap. He did not use the clipped, formal language of the court. He used the old tongue, the language of the hearth, of the pack, of the blood, a language that had not been spoken in this hall for a generation, deemed too primal, too intimate for governance, and the word he spoke was her name, Ilara, a collective, sharp intake of breath across the hall. It was not a request. It was a statement, a claim. The word meant more than a name in that tongue. It was a root, a place of belonging. The hall did not erupt into noise. It fell into a silence so profound it was a physical weight, a crushing, absolute void. Every eye in the room swiveled from the small prince to the woman in the gray dress. Ilara felt the gazes like 1,000 pinpricks, stripping away her invisibility. She was seen. She was caught. Lord Valerius, the king's hand, a man whose silver hair and kindly smile hid a spine of pure ice, took a half step forward, his face a mask of controlled fury. But it was the king who held her. Kalen had not moved. But his stillness had changed. It was no longer the stillness of command. It was the stillness of a wolf sighting its prey. His eyes, black and depthless, found hers across the expanse of stone and held her fast. He did not know her name. He did not know her face. But his son had just bound her to his house, in the old way in front of everyone. The silence stretched, thin and screaming. Then the king's voice, low and cold as a riverbed in winter, cut through it. "Bring her forward." The chamber was not for interrogations. It was the king's private map room, the walls covered in charts of coastlines and disputed borders. The air smelled of old parchment, ink, and the faint, clean scent of snow from the open window that overlooked the northern parapet. It was a room for strategy, for quiet contemplation, and that made it infinitely more threatening than any dungeon. Elara stood in the center of the room, her hands folded before her. King Kalen stood by the window, his back to her, a black silhouette against the gray sky. Lord Valerius was the one who paced his soft-soled boots. He circled her like a predator, his scent sharp with indignation. "An Omega!" Valerius began, his voice a silken weapon. "A common nursery caretaker, teaching the royal heir pack slang, whispering her name into his ear until he parrots it like a trained bird. It is an act of supreme arrogance, or something far worse." Ilara did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the fine layer of dust motes dancing in the shaft of light from the window. She had learned long ago that to meet a threat head-on was to invite it. To look away was to starve it. "I taught him nothing, my lord," she said, her voice even. "I spoke to him. Children who are gravely ill need to hear a voice. It anchors them, and you chose to anchor him with your own name." In that tongue, Valerius stopped in front of her. "Do you know the penalty for imprinting on a royal alpha?" She did not answer. The penalty was death. It was a law so old and barbaric, it was rarely invoked, but it was still on the books. A relic from a time when omegas were believed to hold sway over alpha minds through scent and sound. Valerius had found his weapon. "She has overstepped," he said, now addressing the king's silent back. "She has insinuated herself into the prince's affections to a dangerous degree. She must be removed for the boy's own good, for the stability of the line." The king turned slowly. His face was unreadable, a mask of cold granite. He moved from the window to the large oak table in the center of the room, his presence consuming all the air. He did not look at Alara. He looked at Valerius. "Leave us," he said. It was not a request. Valerius's jaw tightened. For a moment it seemed he might argue, but the king's stillness was an absolute, unassailable wall. With a stiff, resentful bow, the hand departed, the sound of a heavy oak door closing firmly. Silence returned, heavier than before. Now it was just the two of them. Kalen rested his hands on the table, leaning forward slightly, his gaze finally falling upon her. It was like being weighed and measured by something ancient and unforgiving. "He is not wrong," the king said, his voice a low rumble. "You have made yourself essential to my son." "I made him well," Alara corrected softly, her chin lifting a fraction of an inch. His own physicians had given up. "I did not." "And you spoke to him." "I did, in the old tongue." "It was a statement, not a question." "It is the only tongue I have for comfort," she admitted. "The courtly language is for commands and dismissals. The old tongue is for holding something to keep it from breaking." Kalen watched her, his eyes narrowed. He was searching for something. Deceit, ambition, fear. She gave him none of it. She gave him only the quiet, unvarnished truth. He had been alone inside his own silence for so long that he had forgotten the sound of someone who did not want something from him. He had expected pleas or tears or defiance. He received only stillness that mirrored his own. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice rough, as if the words were unfamiliar. "Elara," she said. The name hung in the air between them, the same name his son had spoken. He tested its weight, the feel of it on his tongue. He did not say it aloud. He did not need to. Alara was sent back to the nurseries, but the world had tilted on its axis. She was no longer a ghost, she was a spectacle. The other servants watched her with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Her food was left on a tray outside her door. Conversations fell silent when she entered a room. She was marked. The promotion, when it came, was delivered by a royal page the next morning. By order of the king, she was given sole charge of the royal nursery. Her title was Warden of the Princes. It came with a larger room, a finer dress, and the implicit, suffocating weight of the king's attention. Her new quarters were in the royal wing, adjacent to the children's. The window was larger, overlooking the silent expanse of the courtyard. The first thing she did was open it, letting the cold, clean air rush in, the sound of a heavy sash window being pushed up. It was a cage, she knew, however gilded. A promotion that was also a form of quarantine. By elevating her, Kalen had brought her under his direct control, severing her from the servant class and isolating her from the court. He was containing the anomaly his son had created. That night, he came. She was sitting by the fire, mending a tear in Prince Reese's favorite stuffed wolf, when she felt the change in the room. It was not a sound. It was a drop in temperature, a thickening of the air. She looked up to see him standing in the doorway, a black shadow against the flickering torchlight of the hall. He did not speak, he just watched. He had removed his heavy outer robes and the iron circlet of his crown. He was just a man, broad-shouldered and weary. But the power he carried was an indivisible part of him. He walked over to the hearth, his boots silent on the rushes. He was not there as a king interrogating a subject. He was there as a father. His gaze went to his sons, Reese and his older brother Galen, sleeping soundly in their beds. He watched them for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then his eyes returned to her. He gestured to the toy in her hands. "That was mine," he said, his voice quiet. Ilara's needle paused. She looked down at the worn, one-eyed wolf. "He will not sleep without it." I was the same. The admission was so unexpected, so starkly personal, that it felt like a breach. He was not supposed to share pieces of himself. He was an edifice. He took another step closer, drawn by the small, domestic circle of firelight. He stood over her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the faint scent of cold night air and iron that clung to him. He was witnessing her, not as a problem to be solved or a threat to be managed, but as a woman mending his son's toy. A woman his son had claimed. "The fever," he said abruptly. "How did you break it?" "Willow bark tea, cooled with snowmelt." A cold compress of lavender and mint on his brow and at his wrists, she answered, her voice low. "And I did not leave him." Kalen's gaze was intense. He had been given reports, of course, dry, clinical things from the royal physicians. But this was different. This was the truth of it, spoken in the quiet of the nursery. She did not leave him. The simplicity of it was more powerful than any medical explanation. It was the language of pact. The king's decree echoed through the stone halls, a formal announcement that did little to quell the whispers. Elara was now a fixture, a permanent and unsettling presence in the royal wing. Lord Valerius and his faction at court treated her with a cloying, venomous courtesy. They bowed when she passed, their smiles as thin and sharp as razor wire. They saw an Omega who had schemed her way into the king's confidence, a parasite clinging to the heart of the pack. They did not see the exhaustion that settled deep in her bones, the constant humming tension of being watched. Her life became a series of quiet, repeated rituals, waking the princes, dressing them, walking with them in the walled garden, telling them stories by the fire. And through it all, she was aware of Kylan. He did not seek her out, not directly, but his presence was a constant orbit. He would appear in the doorway of the nursery as she was settling the children for the night, a silent observer in the shadows. He took to working at a small desk in the corner of the nursery's antechamber, poring over ledgers and dispatches. He claimed the light was better there. She knew it was a lie. He was habituating himself to her presence, studying her as he might study a map of a new and dangerous territory. He never spoke of the incident in the great hall. It was a stone dropped into a deep well, the ripples still spreading silently beneath the surface. One afternoon, as a cold rain lashed against the windows, she was teaching Reese his letters, her finger tracing the shapes in a shallow tray of sand. Kalen was at his desk, the scratch of his quill the only sound in the room. Reese, frustrated with the curve of a particular rune, knocked the tray over, the soft hiss of sand spilling across a stone floor. Sand scattered across the floor before Alara could react. Kalen was there. He knelt, producing a small brush and dustpan from a nearby alcove. He did not summon a servant. He did not command her to clean it. He simply began to sweep up the mess his son had made. Alara knelt opposite him, her hands gathering the larger piles of sand. For a moment, they worked in silence, their heads bent, their hands almost touching. It was an act of such unexpected domesticity that it felt more intimate than any conversation. "He has your temper," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Kalen looked up, a flicker of something, surprise, amusement, in his dark eyes. A small smile, so faint it was barely there, touched his lips. And his mother's impatience. It was the first time he had ever mentioned the late queen. The words hung in the air between them, a shared confidence that was both a comfort and a danger. The moment passed. He finished sweeping the sand, stood and returned to his desk without another word. But the barrier between them had been breached. He had allowed her to see a glimpse of the man beneath the crown, and she had shown him that she was not afraid to speak a simple truth. The silence that resettled was different. It was no longer the silence of suspicion, but the silence of two people who were beginning to learn the shape of each other's solitude. The whispers at court began to coalesce into a coherent threat. Lord Valerius was not a man to accept defeat. He was a master of procedure, of using the intricate, centuries-old laws of the kingdom as a weapon. Alara started to notice the change in the guards posted outside the nursery. They were Valerius's men, their faces grim and watchful. The servants who brought her meals were new, their eyes averted, their hands trembling slightly as they set down the trays. She was being isolated further, a deliberate, calculated pressure being applied. She focused on the children, her one unwavering purpose. They were her anchor in the shifting political tides. Galen, the older brother, was quiet and observant like his father and had slowly begun to seek her out for stories. Reese remained her shadow, his small hand often finding hers as they walked. He was the source of her predicament, but he was also her sanctuary. Kalen's presence in the nursery became more frequent, his stays longer. He seemed to use the room as a refuge from the pressures of his court. He would read dispatches, his brow furrowed, the weight of his kingdom resting on his shoulders. He rarely spoke to her, but she felt his awareness of her every move, the way she soothed a scraped knee, the quiet firmness with which she settled a squabble between the brothers. He was watching her govern his smallest, most vulnerable territory, and in her competence, He seemed to find a strange sort of peace. One evening, the tension that had been building for weeks finally broke the surface. Kalen was staring into the fire, a half-empty goblet of wine in his hand, his mood darker and more volatile than she had ever seen it. Valerius invoked the purity statutes in council today, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He did not look at her. He spoke to the flames. Ilara's blood ran cold. The purity statutes were ancient, draconian laws designed to prevent omegas from gaining influence over alpha bloodlines. They were based on superstition and fear. Speaking of scent bonds and thrall, to invoke them was to accuse her of a form of witchcraft. He suggests you are a danger to the succession, Kalen continued, his grip tightening on the goblet, that your bond with Reese is unnatural. He proposes you be sent to the Silent Sisters for cleansing. The Silent Sisters, an abbey on a remote, storm-lashed island from which no one ever returned. It was a sentence of living death. Ilara stood very still, her hands clasped behind her back. She had known Valerius was her enemy, but she had not grasped the depth of his malice. She had been so focused on the king's reaction, she had underestimated the institutional hatred of the court itself. She waited for Kalen to tell her what he would do. She expected him to speak of political necessity, of difficult choices. Instead, he turned his head and looked at her, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He believes your scent will permanently mark him, make him weak. He said the words as if they were poison in his mouth. Then, a single, dry, involuntary sound escaped him. It was not a laugh. It was the sound of utter contempt. They think a king's strength is in his blood, he said, more to himself than to her. They don't understand. It is in what he refuses to sacrifice. A storm broke over the castle that night, a howling gale that rattled the window frames and sent drafts snaking across the stone floors. Rice, always a light sleeper, woke from a nightmare. His cries sharp and terrified, the sound of a child's panicked crying, muffled by distance. Ilara was by his side in an instant, gathering him into her arms, murmuring soft words of comfort. His small body was rigid with fear, his hands clutching at her dress. He was dreaming of the fever, he sobbed, of the heat and the darkness. Ilara held him close, rocking him gently. She began to hum a low melodic tune that vibrated through her chest. It was an old song, a lullaby from the forgotten corners of the world, from a pack that no longer existed. The words came unbidden to her lips, whispered in the old tongue. It was a song about a wolf finding its way home through a snowstorm, following the light of a single star. She did not know he was there until he spoke from the shadows near the door. My mother sang that song. Kalen's voice was rough, thick with an emotion she could not name. He stepped into the firelight, his face etched with a profound, unguarded sorrow. He looked not like a king, but like a man ambushed by a ghost. Ilara fell silent, her hand still stroking Reese's hair as the boy's sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. "Where did you learn it?" Kalen asked, his voice low. "My mother," she answered quietly. "She was from the northern clans. They were lost in the border wars when I was a girl. She did not offer details. She did not perform her pain for him. It was a simple, brutal fact, a wound that had long ago calcified into self-sufficiency. But in that moment, in the storm-tossed quiet of the nursery, the wound was visible. He saw it. He crossed the room and knelt by the bed, his eyes on his son, who was now drifting back to sleep. The king reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently brushed a stray lock of hair from Reese's forehead. The gesture was so tender, so full of a grief he kept locked away behind his iron mask, that it made Alara's throat tighten. He understood now. The old tongue, the lullabies, her fierce devotion to his sons. It was not ambition. It was the echo of a pack she had lost. She was rebuilding a home in the ruins of her past, and his children were the foundation. "He is safe with you?" Kaylin said. It was not a question. It was a realization, spoken aloud. It was the sound of a wall crumbling within him. He looked at her. Then, his gaze raw and exposed, he was not saved by her. He was witnessed by her. And in the flickering light of the nursery, surrounded by the sleeping forms of his children, the lonely king finally let someone see the man who carried the crown. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the truth of their shared losses, a quiet, unspoken understanding that was more profound than any words. The storm raged outside, but within the small circle of their firelight, a fragile peace had taken hold. The next morning, the summons came. Not for her, but for the king. Lord Valerius had formally petitioned the council, forcing the king's hand. The purity statutes were to be read, and a judgment passed on the Omega caretaker. The threat was no longer a whisper. It was a blade laid bare on the council table. Alara spent the day in a state of suspended animation. She went through the motions of her duties with a calm that felt brittle, as if it might shatter at any moment. She dressed the princes, read to them, and answered their endless questions, all while a storm of silent fear raged within her. She knew the power Valerius wielded. He was the voice of tradition, of order, of a system that had kept alphas on top and omegas at the bottom for centuries. Kaelin was king, but even he was not above the ancient laws that bound their society together. To defy the council on this would be to declare war on his own court. She did not believe he would do it. He was a pragmatist, a ruler who understood the necessity of sacrifice. She was a political liability, an Omega caretaker who had become a symbol of disorder. Sacrificing her would be the logical, strategic choice. She expected to be arrested by the castle guard before nightfall. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the nursery floor, she began to pack. She had few possessions: a change of clothes, a small carved wooden bird her father had made for her, a worn book of songs. She folded everything neatly into a small canvas satchel. She would not wait for them to drag her away. She would face it on her own terms. She was kneeling on the floor, tucking the last of her things into the bag, when the door opened. It was Kaelin. He had come directly from the council chamber. He still wore his formal robes of state, the heavy silver clasp of his office pinning a cloak of black wolf pelt at his shoulder. His face was grim, carved from stone. He saw the satchel on the floor, saw her kneeling beside it, and his expression hardened into something unreadable. He closed the door behind him, the heavy thud echoing in the quiet room. The decisive sound of a heavy door latching shut. "You thought I would let them take you," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, heavy with a disappointment she did not understand. She rose to her feet, her movements fluid and unhurried. "You are the king, your grace. You must do what is best for the kingdom. And you believe casting you out is what is best?" She met his gaze directly. "It is what is simplest. It would appease Valerius and his allies. It would restore order." "There is no order in abandoning your own," he countered, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He took a step toward her, then another, until he was standing directly before her, a mountain of silent fury. The air crackled between them. He had been fighting for her. She realized it with a sudden, shocking clarity. He had gone into that council chamber and waged a war on her behalf. "The council has been instructed," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "The purity statutes will be revised. Lord Valerius has been granted a leave of absence to inspect fortifications on the northern border. It will be a very long winter." He had not just won. He had dismantled his enemy, piece by piece. With the cold, precise cruelty she was beginning to recognize as his signature, he had protected her. But it was the way he looked at her now that stole the air from her lungs. The king was gone. In his place was a man who had made a choice that had cost him, a choice that had changed everything. He had won the political battle, but the war between them, the silent, unspoken thing that had been building since that first day in the Great Hall, was reaching its climax. He stood before her in the fading light, the scent of the council chamber, old stone, beeswax, and the bitter tang of fear from other men clinging to him. She saw the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, the immense cost of the power he wielded. She had been prepared to leave without a fight, to disappear back into the gray anonymity from which she had come. Her self-sufficiency was her shield, her greatest defense. And he was looking at her, as if he meant to tear it away with his bare hands. "Did you truly believe I would sacrifice you?" he asked again, his voice lower this time and laced with something she could not decipher. It was not anger. It was something that felt dangerously close to pain. "I believed you would protect your sons and your crown," she replied, her own voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart. "That is what a king does." "And what does a man do?" he countered, the question hanging between them, sharp and perilous. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently push the canvas satchel with the toe of his boot. A small, dismissive gesture that undid her completely. It was a rejection of her readiness to leave, a denial of her right to run. He was telling her without words that she was no longer free to disappear. He had bound her to this place, to him with the political chains he had forged in the council. But that was not enough. He took another step, closing the final space between them. He was so close now, she could see the flecks of silver in his dark eyes. She braced herself, expecting a command, a declaration, something that would reestablish the familiar lines of power between them, king and subject, alpha and omega. But he did nothing of the sort. He simply looked at her, his gaze stripping away every layer of her composure, every wall she had ever built. And then he spoke. He used the old tongue. The sound of it in the quiet room was as intimate as a touch, as binding as an oath. He said her name, just as his son had Alara. But then he added another word, a word that had not been heard in the royal court for 500 years. A word that meant more than kin, more than shield, more than protector. He said, Mayaj, my heart sworn, my anchor, the one who holds the sen. Absolute silence. It was not a proposal. It was not a romantic declaration. It was a statement of absolute, irreversible fact, a claiming, in the language of the blood, in the tongue of the pack. He had named her. He had taken the anonymous Omega caretaker and made her the unshakable center of his world. He had not just saved her from his enemies. He had bound her to himself with a word more powerful than any law, more permanent than any crown. Her carefully packed bag lay forgotten on the floor between them, a symbol of a life she could no longer return to. The court was in an uproar, but it was a silent, terrified one. A king had not used that word, had not made that bond in living memory. It was a power drawn from the very earth of the kingdom, older than any council, more absolute than any throne. Lord Valerius did not even pack. He was gone before dawn, his political ruin so complete that his name was never spoken again. Ilara was no longer the warden of the princes. She held no official title at all. She did not need one. Her status was now absolute, woven into the very fabric of the royal house. But in the quiet world of the nursery, nothing changed, and everything changed. She still woke the princes in the morning. She still walked with them in the garden. She still mended their clothes by the fire. Her life was the same collection of small, quiet rituals. The difference was him. Kalen was no longer a visitor in the nursery. It became his sanctuary, the true seat of his power. He moved his desk, his maps, his entire world into the antechamber. He ruled his kingdom from the room adjacent to where his son slept, where she lived. They existed in a new kind of stillness together. The tension was gone, replaced by a deep, humming quiet of acceptance. They spoke, but rarely of anything important. They would discuss the weather, a book he was reading, Galen's progress with his swordsmanship. Their real conversations happened in the spaces between the words, in the way he would look up from a dispatch when she entered the room, in the way she would place a cup of hot tea at his elbow without being asked, in the shared glances over the heads of his playing children. It was an intimacy built not on declarations, but on 1,000 silent acts of witness. One night, weeks later, she was sitting by the fire reading to Reese, her voice a low murmur. Kalen was at his desk, the room filled with the comfortable scratch of his quill on parchment. Rice, sleepy and warm, leaned his head against her shoulder, his small hand resting on her arm. Kalen stopped writing. He watched them for a long moment, his face in the shadows cast by the candlelight. He rose from his desk and came to the hearth, not with the weight of a king, but with the quiet tread of a man coming home. He did not speak. He knelt before her, his knee brushing the floorboards. He reached out and gently took Reese's small hand from her arm, his large, calloused fingers closing around his son's. Then he laid his other hand over hers. His touch was warm, firm, a silent anchor in the quiet room. Her hand, his hand, and the hand of his son, all resting together, the soft crackle of a log shifting in the hearth. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not a kingdom or a crown or a victory, but a vast, silent landscape of a solitude that was finally, blessedly, at an end. It was the presence of everything that mattered. It was the hard-won, deeply intimate stillness that felt more like a beginning than any ending ever could. The world outside the nursery continued its relentless turn. Couriers came and went, their boots echoing in the stone corridors. Lords petitioned for audiences and were politely, but firmly, turned away from the nursery wing. The governance of the kingdom now flowed through this quiet, domestic space, a fact that baffled the court and solidified Kalen's reputation as an unpredictable, dangerous ruler. He was a king who had turned his back on the great hall in favor of a fireside and an omega with quiet hands for Alara. The change was internal. The hypervigilance she had lived with for years, the constant need to be invisible and unthreatening, slowly began to recede. It was a physical untensing, a gradual relaxation of muscles she hadn't even known were clenched. She still opened her window every morning, but it was no longer an escape route. It was simply a way to let in the clean, cold air. She began to learn the landscape of his silence. She could distinguish the silence of deep thought from the silence of weariness, the silence of anger from the silence of peace. He, in turn, learned hers. He knew the slight downturn of her lips meant one of the boys was feeling unwell. He knew the specific rhythm of her breathing when she was lost in a story. They were two solitary creatures who had, against all odds, learned to share the same territory without the need for noise. Their bond was not spoken of again. The word majas had been a key, turning in a lock. The door had been opened, and there was no need to keep rattling it. Its power was in its permanence, not its repetition. One afternoon, while Galen and Reese were napping, she was arranging dried herbs in small linen bags, the scent of lavender and chamomile filling the air. Galen was at his map table, tracing a border dispute with a single finger. "The river is rising at the western pass," he said, not looking up. "The spring thaw came too early. The village in the lowlands will be flooded by week's end." Elara paused, a sprig of lavender in her hand. "The old watchtower on the high ridge," she said. "Is it still sound?" He finally looked up, his brow furrowed. "The roof is gone, but the walls are stone, and it is high enough. They could shelter there. Their flocks, too." He stared at her, a slow, dawning realization in his eyes. She was seeing a map of his people. He had been thinking in terms of garrisons and levies, of strategic losses. She was thinking of wet children and frightened sheep. He slowly straightened up from the table, his gaze intense. He had found his queen, not in a foreign court or a noble house, but in a quiet omega who understood that the true strength of a pack was not in its alpha, but in its unwavering commitment to its most vulnerable members. He came to her, taking the linen bag from her hands and setting it down. He took her hands in his, turning them over, studying the faint calluses on her fingertips from her needle, the trace of soil from the herb garden. These were not the hands of a court lady. They were the hands of a caretaker. The hands that had saved his son, the hands that were, without conscious thought, now saving him, Elara. He said her name, a quiet prayer. And for the first time, she smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. It was shocking in its brightness, a sudden sunrise in the quiet, shadowed room. And Kalen, the silent king of a stone-cold kingdom, felt its warmth as if he had been freezing his entire life and had only just realized it.